The party at Alice's house was supposed to be a relaxing evening. Stephanie had been talking about it for weeks, her excitement infectious at first, though I could never quite match her energy. She'd spent the entire day getting ready, carefully choosing her dress and perfecting her makeup. She looked beautiful, she always did, but there was something in her demeanor that felt off. She seemed distracted, almost detached, like her mind was elsewhere. I convinced myself it was nothing. Stephanie had always been outgoing and lively at social gatherings, the kind of person who could effortlessly draw attention without trying. I had always admired that about her, but that night, for reasons I couldn't explain, it unsettled me. Maybe it was the way she insisted on driving separately to the party, saying she'd be staying late to help Alice clean up. Or maybe it was how she avoided eye contact as we walked into the crowded house together. Alice's parties were always lively, packed with mutual friends and acquaintances. It didn't take long for Stephanie to melt into the crowd, her laugh rising above the hum of conversation as she found her rhythm. I tried to relax, chatting with a few colleagues I hadn't seen in a while. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I caught glimpses of Stephanie weaving through the room, drink in hand, her smile dazzling as ever. She seemed comfortable, almost too comfortable, with the attention she was getting. It was then that I noticed Ryan. He was standing across the room, his eyes fixed on Stephanie in a way that made my stomach tighten. I'd never met him before, but something about the way he carried himself put me on edge. He was charismatic and confident, the type of guy who thrived in these kinds of settings. I watched as he made his way toward her, striking up a conversation like it was the most natural thing in the world. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. People flirt at parties all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't ignore the growing connection between them. Ryan was always nearby, leaning in just a little too close, his body language screaming interest. And Stephanie, she didn't exactly seem to mind. She laughed at his jokes, her hand brushing his arm as she talked. She looked lighter, freer, almost as if I wasn't even there. Every time I caught her eye, she'd flash me a quick smile before turning back to Ryan. It felt rehearsed, like she was trying to keep up appearances but couldn't be bothered to really include me. When I finally found a moment to pull her aside, she waved off my concerns, saying I was being ridiculous. She claimed Ryan was just being friendly, that I had nothing to worry about. But I did worry. There was something about the way she acted around him that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the flirting, it was the ease with which she let it happen. Like she'd forgotten I was her husband. Like she'd forgotten I existed. As the night wore on, my unease only grew. Stephanie and Ryan seemed to orbit each other, their interactions becoming more frequent, more intimate in a way I couldn't ignore. Whenever I moved to another part of the house, I'd glance back and catch him leaning toward her, their heads close, as if they were sharing secrets. She didn't seem to notice, or care, that I was watching. I tried to focus on anything else, talking to old friends and picking at the appetizers, but I kept losing track of the conversations. My eyes were drawn to her like a magnet. It wasn't just Ryan's presence that unsettled me, it was how Stephanie was acting. She was more animated than usual, her laughter louder, her gestures more exaggerated. It felt like she was performing, playing a role that I wasn't a part of. At one point, she walked past me with a drink in her hand, her smile bright but fleeting, as though I were just another guest at the party. When I tried to ask if she was okay or if she needed anything, she brushed me off with a quick, "I'm fine." Though it wasn't the words themselves but her tone that lingered. Dismissive. Distant. I caught her talking to Alice in the kitchen later, their heads close as they whispered. Alice glanced at me briefly, her face unreadable, before they both burst into laughter. Stephanie turned away, her hand over her mouth as though hiding something. It was the kind of laugh you share when you're in on a joke at someone else's expense. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just being paranoid. But the knot in my stomach tightened. The tipping point came when I spotted Stephanie heading toward the upstairs hallway with Ryan trailing behind her. They weren't talking anymore, they were just walking, her pace slightly quicker than his. My heart sank as I watched them disappear around the corner, their silhouettes vanishing into the shadows. I waited a moment, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with excuses, rationalizations, anything to make sense of what I'd just seen. Maybe she needed something from one of the rooms upstairs. Maybe it was innocent, and I'd only embarrass myself if I made a scene. But deep down, I knew better. I knew I couldn't let it go. As casually as I could manage, I made my way toward the stairs, weaving through the clusters of guests who were still laughing and drinking, oblivious to the turmoil in my chest. I climbed the steps slowly, my hands gripping the banister tighter than necessary, my ears straining for any sound that might confirm, or deny, my worst fears. At the top of the stairs, I paused, scanning the empty hallway. A door at the end was slightly ajar, the faint murmur of voices drifting out. My breath caught in my throat as I moved closer, the air growing heavier with each step. Whatever I found on the other side of that door, I knew there was no going back. When I reached the door, my hand hovered over it, trembling. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave whatever was happening behind that door unknown. But I couldn't. My mind replayed every moment of the night, her laughter, the glances, the way Ryan had followed her up here. I needed to know. I pushed the door open slowly, enough to see inside but not enough to alert them to my presence. There they were. Stephanie and Ryan, tangled together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Her back was to me, her hand pressed against his chest as his face hovered inches from hers. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't pulling away. If anything, she seemed comfortable. For a moment, I froze. Time slowed, and everything around me became distant, muffled, like I was underwater. My chest felt tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was like watching someone else's life fall apart, except it wasn't. It was mine. The woman I had trusted, the one I had loved and built a life with, was standing in front of me, betraying me in the most gut-wrenching way possible. I didn't think. I just acted. I stepped into the room, and my movement must have caught Stephanie's eye because she spun around, her expression shifting from shock to panic in an instant. She stammered something, her hands raising as if to calm me, to explain, but the words didn't even register. Ryan looked equally startled, his smug confidence from earlier in the night wiped clean. Stephanie stepped forward, trying to close the distance between us, but I couldn't stand to look at her. Every step she took felt like another twist of the knife. Her words came in a rush, disjointed excuses, weak attempts to downplay what I'd seen. She claimed it wasn't what it looked like, that I was overreacting. But the scene had burned itself into my mind, and no amount of her lies could undo that. I didn't yell. I didn't lash out. I simply turned and walked away. Each step out of that room felt heavier than the last, my legs barely carrying me as I stumbled back down the stairs. The party was still in full swing, laughter and music blaring in sharp contrast to the chaos inside me. I didn't care who saw me leave. I didn't care about anything except putting as much distance between me and that house as possible. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap, but it didn't help. My head was spinning, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I needed to go somewhere, anywhere, but I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Stephanie's voice echoed in my ears, her lies, her betrayal, the way she had looked at him like he mattered more than I ever did. I ended up at my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with questions, accusations, and memories of every moment we'd shared, now tainted by what I'd just seen. I didn't know where to go or what to do, but one thing was certain. I couldn't go back into that house. I couldn't face her. Not now. Maybe not ever. Sitting in the car, I fought the urge to drive off and never look back. Every instinct told me to leave, to escape this nightmare before it consumed me completely. But something held me there, a gnawing sense of unfinished business. I couldn't just let it end like this, not without confronting the truth head-on. I got out of the car and walked back toward the house, my legs moving on autopilot. The sounds of laughter and music spilled out as I stepped inside, the warmth of the party a sharp contrast to the cold hollowness I felt. It was as though nothing had changed, as though the betrayal I just witnessed hadn't happened. The world kept turning while mine fell apart. Stephanie was at the bottom of the stairs when I re-entered, her face pale, her expression frantic as she scanned the room for me. The moment our eyes met, she froze. Her composure was cracking, but even now, I could see her calculating, scrambling to figure out how to spin this, how to salvage the situation. She came toward me, her hands raised in a gesture that was supposed to calm me, to control me. I saw her mouth moving, but I didn't hear the words. My head was too full of noise, her laughter with Ryan, the murmur of their voices upstairs, the image of them so close it was unbearable. All around us, people started to notice the tension. Alice appeared from somewhere, her concerned expression doing little to hide the unease in her eyes. She must have known something, or at least suspected. I could feel the weight of the stares, the murmurs spreading as the room turned its attention to us. Stephanie was speaking faster now, her voice growing more desperate. She kept saying it wasn't what I thought, that I was blowing everything out of proportion. Her excuses piled up, each one more hollow than the last. She even tried to blame Ryan, saying he had misunderstood her friendliness, that she had no idea he'd follow her upstairs. It was a lie so transparent it almost made me laugh. Ryan appeared then, emerging from the hallway looking more smug than ashamed. He didn't even try to apologize or explain himself. If anything, he seemed entertained by the chaos he'd caused, his smirk adding fuel to the fire already raging inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. Every word out of Stephanie's mouth was a dagger, every look from the crowd a reminder of how far my world had fallen in such a short span of time. I cut her off mid-sentence, my voice low but firm as I told her I'd had enough. I didn't yell. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The weight of my words, and the betrayal they carried, was enough to silence her. For the first time that night, she seemed at a loss, her confidence faltering under the reality of what she'd done. I turned and walked out, ignoring the whispers and the stares that followed me. Stephanie didn't come after me this time. She stayed behind, left to deal with the wreckage of her own making. Back in the car, I sat in silence, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. Every detail felt sharper now, more vivid. The way she had laughed with him, the way she had brushed off my concerns, the way she had lied without hesitation. It wasn't just the betrayal that cut so deeply, it was the realization that I had never really known the person I thought I loved. With nowhere else to go, I drove aimlessly, the road stretching out in front of me like a lifeline. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go home. Not to her. Not anymore. After driving aimlessly for what felt like hours, I ended up in front of Damon's house. Damon had been my closest friend since college, the kind of person who always had your back no matter what. If anyone could help me make sense of this mess, it was him. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the darkened windows. It was late, too late to be showing up unannounced, but I couldn't bring myself to go anywhere else. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, the weight of the night pressing down on me like a physical force. Eventually, I got out and knocked on the door. Damon opened it a moment later, bleary-eyed and half asleep, but the concern on his face was immediate. I must have looked as broken as I felt because he didn't ask any questions. He just stepped aside and let me in, his quiet understanding more comforting than any words could have been. Once inside, I sat on his couch, staring at the floor while he brought me a drink. The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Damon knew me well enough to let me speak when I was ready. For a while, I couldn't find the words to describe what had happened. Every time I tried, the image of Stephanie with Ryan came rushing back, leaving me breathless and hollow. Eventually, I managed to tell him everything. I recounted the party, the moments that had felt off, and the sickening realization when I'd found them upstairs. As the words spilled out, so did the anger, the humiliation, and the crushing sense of betrayal. Damon listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as I spoke. Talking about it should have made me feel lighter, but it didn't. If anything, it made the reality of what had happened even clearer. Stephanie, the woman I had loved and trusted with everything, had destroyed the life we'd built together in one night. Or maybe it wasn't just one night. Maybe this had been building for longer than I realized. The questions were endless, each one more painful than the last. Had there been other Ryans? Had she been lying to me for months, or years? Was our entire marriage a facade, built on the illusion of trust while she played a different role behind my back? Damon didn't try to offer platitudes or easy answers. He just let me talk, letting the storm inside me rage until it began to subside. When the words finally ran out, I felt drained, like I'd poured every ounce of myself into reliving the betrayal. But the pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting. It sat heavy in my chest, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. The life I thought I had, the woman I thought I knew, it was all gone, replaced by something I couldn't recognize. Damon offered me a place to stay, insisting I shouldn't go home that night. The idea of walking back into that house, of facing Stephanie, was unbearable. I couldn't stand the thought of her lies, her excuses, her empty apologies. I needed space to think, to figure out what came next. As I lay on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling, I tried to imagine a future beyond this. A life without Stephanie, without the weight of her betrayal hanging over me. It felt impossible, like trying to see through a fog that refused to lift. But I knew I couldn't stay trapped in this moment forever. Somehow, I had to move forward, even if it felt like I was leaving everything behind. The next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly. I knew who it was without looking. Stephanie. Her messages had started late the night before, a steady stream of apologies, excuses, and pleas for me to come home. Each one seemed more frantic than the last, her desperation bleeding through the screen. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Her words felt hollow, dripping with the same manipulation she had used at the party. She was trying to control the narrative, to twist what had happened into something less damaging. It wasn't what you think, she wrote over and over, as if repeating the lie enough times would make it true. Later that morning, she called. I let it ring. And then again. And again. By the fifth call, Damon gestured for me to answer, his expression urging me to confront her. Reluctantly, I picked up, bracing myself for the flood of excuses I knew was coming. Her voice was soft, trembling with emotion, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or just fear of losing control. She begged me to come home, claiming she had explanations for everything, that I'd misunderstood what I saw. She swore nothing had happened, that it was a momentary lapse in judgment, a misunderstanding between friends. But her excuses unraveled as quickly as she spun them. When I pointed out that Ryan had followed her upstairs, her tone shifted. She tried to blame the alcohol, saying she hadn't been thinking clearly. When I reminded her that she'd dismissed my concerns earlier in the night, she stumbled, insisting she hadn't wanted to cause a scene at Alice's party. It was exhausting, listening to her weave lie after lie. Her attempts to shift the blame onto me, saying I was paranoid, overreacting, too controlling, stung, but they didn't surprise me. This wasn't the first time Stephanie had used her charm to deflect accountability. Her tone shifted again when it became clear I wasn't buying her story. The desperation seeped in, her words coming faster, more emotional. She begged for another chance, promising it would never happen again. She said she loved me, that she couldn't imagine life without me. For a brief moment, her words stirred something in me. Memories of the life we'd built together, the years we'd shared, flashed through my mind. It would have been so easy to let her back in, to pretend this was just a bump in the road. But then I remembered the look in her eyes when she was with Ryan, the ease with which she had let him into a space that was supposed to be ours. I remembered how she had brushed off my concerns, lied to my face, and dismissed me like I was nothing. Her pleas couldn't erase the betrayal, no matter how sincere they sounded. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't come home yet. She cried, accusing me of giving up on us, of being cold and unforgiving. But I stood firm. I wouldn't let her guilt me into returning. When the call ended, I felt hollow, like I had drained the last bit of energy I had left. Stephanie's lies had been relentless, but her tears, whether genuine or not, were harder to shake. A part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that this could be fixed. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't something that could be undone with apologies or promises. The foundation of our marriage was shattered, and no amount of pleading could put it back together. In the days that followed, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of walking through that door and seeing her face, hearing her voice, made my stomach churn. Stephanie continued her relentless attempts to reach me. Calls, texts, voicemails, each one blurring the line between remorse and manipulation. She cycled through emotions, sometimes apologizing, sometimes accusing me of being unfair for not giving her a chance to explain. I spent those days at Damon's house, trying to piece together what I wanted to do next. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, alternating between anger, sadness, and sheer disbelief. Every memory of our marriage felt tainted now. I'd lie awake at night, replaying moments I'd once cherished, wondering if they were as genuine as I'd believed. Stephanie's betrayal wasn't just about Ryan. It was about trust, about the life we'd built together and how easily she had torn it apart. I kept asking myself the same questions. Was she sorry for what she did, or was she just sorry she got caught? If I forgave her, could I ever trust her again? Could I even look at her without seeing the image of her and Ryan in that room? The answers were always the same. I couldn't. One evening, after hours of pacing and second-guessing, I made my decision. I was going to end it. There was no other way. Staying with Stephanie would mean living in constant doubt, always wondering if she'd betray me again. That wasn't a life I was willing to endure. Telling her was harder than I expected. When I finally called her, she answered immediately, her voice filled with cautious hope. I kept my tone steady, refusing to let my emotions get the better of me. I told her I couldn't see a future for us anymore, that what she'd done had broken something irreparable. At first, she tried to argue, insisting that we could work through this, that she'd do whatever it took to make things right. But when she realized I wasn't budging, her tone shifted. The desperation turned to anger. She accused me of being stubborn, of throwing away everything we'd built over a mistake. Her words stung, but I stood firm. I told her that this wasn't about one mistake. It was about the pattern of lies, the disregard for our relationship, and the betrayal of trust. She cried, but I didn't let myself get drawn in. I had to focus on what was best for me, no matter how much it hurt. By the end of the call, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't happiness, it was too soon for that, but it was a weight lifted, a clarity I hadn't felt in days. For the first time since the party, I could see a path forward, even if it was a lonely one. The next step was meeting with a lawyer. Damon helped me find someone who specialized in family law, a calm and competent woman who didn't sugarcoat the process. As we discussed dividing assets, the logistics of filing, and what life might look like post-divorce, it all felt surreal. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself, but it was the one I had now. Stephanie didn't take the news well. She continued to reach out, switching between tearful pleas and scathing remarks. She begged me to reconsider, accusing me of being cold-hearted, of not fighting for our marriage. But every message she sent only reinforced my decision. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. When I filed the papers, I felt a finality settle over me. It wasn't the kind of closure I'd hoped for. It was bitter, tinged with regret for the life we'd lost, but it was closure nonetheless. For better or worse, this chapter was over. The days after filing for divorce were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The silence was deafening. No more texts from Stephanie, no more calls, no more pleading. I had finally blocked her number. But even though her voice was gone, her presence lingered everywhere. I'd catch myself thinking about her when I saw something as simple as her favorite coffee brand or an old photo on my phone. At Damon's house, I tried to stay busy. He was patient, never pushing me to talk but always offering a distraction when I needed it. I started going on long walks, just to clear my head, letting the crisp air and open roads pull me away from the chaos in my mind. One evening, as I sat on Damon's back porch, staring at the stars, I realized something. As painful as the betrayal was, there was also a strange kind of freedom in it. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied to Stephanie's expectations or her subtle manipulations. I wasn't constantly second-guessing myself, wondering if I was doing enough to make her happy. The house I'd shared with Stephanie still felt like a ghost town to me. I only went back to pack some essentials and grab paperwork for the divorce. Walking into the bedroom we'd once shared felt like walking into someone else's life. The bed, the photos, the little mementos of our marriage, they all seemed foreign now. But what stuck with me the most was a letter I found on the nightstand. Stephanie had left it there, scrawled in her familiar handwriting. It was long, full of apologies and confessions. She admitted to having flirted with other men before Ryan, though she insisted she had never crossed the line until that night. She begged for forgiveness, claiming she'd made a terrible mistake and still loved me. I didn't read the whole thing. I couldn't. Her words felt hollow, too little too late. I folded the letter and left it on the counter. Whatever closure I needed, it wasn't going to come from her. Moving forward wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when I questioned whether I'd made the right decision. But every time I started to doubt, I reminded myself of that night, of the lies, the betrayal, and the way she'd looked at me as though I were the problem. Damon became my anchor, pulling me out of my worst moments. He encouraged me to rebuild, to focus on the things that mattered. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again. I reconnected with old hobbies, things I'd let go of during my marriage. I spent more time with friends I hadn't seen in years, people who reminded me of the life I'd had before Stephanie. I wasn't ready to think about dating again, not yet. The idea of trusting someone that deeply felt impossible. But I didn't need to rush. For now, it was enough to focus on healing, on rediscovering who I was without her. There were still scars, of course. Betrayal doesn't fade overnight. Some nights, the memories crept back in, uninvited and unwelcome. But with each passing day, they held a little less power over me. One weekend, Damon and I went hiking, something we used to do back in college. Standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over miles of untouched forest, I felt a strange sense of peace. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it was quieter now, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. I had lost so much. My marriage, my trust, the future I'd envisioned, but I hadn't lost everything. I still had people who cared about me, and I still had myself. And that was enough to start over. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward, step by step, leaving the wreckage behind. Stephanie's betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to define me. I had a chance to rebuild, to find something better. And that was exactly what I intended to do.